Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I will be reviewing Ngaio Marsh's very first novel, A Man Lay Dead, which celebrates its 90th anniversary this year. It is the first appearance of Inspector Roderick Alleyn and his journalist friend Nigel Bathgate, although we do not yet meet Inspector Fox or Agatha Troy. And I've always found this book to be one of the lesser Ngaio Marsh novels. I mean, it's not bad, but Marsh would go on to be pretty vocal about how much she just did not like this book. And while I don't think it's as bad as how she claimed it was, you can very much tell this is a first novel by an author who had not yet mastered her craft. As always, when I review novels, there will be a spoiler free summary with commentary up until the point the murderer is revealed. And from that point forward, spoilers are fair game. And I will warn you when I switch to spoilers, so feel free to listen up until that point if you don't want to be spoiled. As I summarize, I'll insert my own commentary in from time to time. Now, before I begin, make sure you like and subscribe to keep up to date with the channel. A Man Lay Dead begins with Nigel Bathgate traveling to a weekend house party. I should mention that Bathgate is really the star of this novel, not Roderick Alleyn. Alleyn does not appear until quite a bit later into the book, and while that's not unusual, Nigel here really is the lead as we get most of the novel from his point of view, although the book is third person perspective. Nigel is young, he's mentioned to be 25, and not too well off, although he is a journalist, which gets mocked quite a bit, and he's on his way to the country estate of Frantock with his older, wealthier cousin, Charles Rankin. Nigel does not like Charles, who is like too outgoing and too boorish for the somewhat like awkward and introverted Nigel. Nigel and Charles are on a train when they meet most of the other guests who are going to be at the house party, specifically Arthur and Marjorie Wilde and Rosamund Grant, whom Charles immediately has his hands all over. And when they arrive at the station, everyone just sort of dumps Nigel on Angela North because she has a bad car and no one wants to ride in it. Nigel and Angela are somewhat awkward. I mean, Charles hinted to Nigel that maybe he should date Angela, as they seem to have a connection the previous time they met. Angela's uncle is Sir Hubert Hansley, who owns Frantock and is obsessed with playing the murder game. His house is full of unusual weapons, as Sir Hubert is a bit of a collector, which just adds to the intrigue and mystery of the setting. This is a classic parlor game murder mystery novel, which were very popular in the 1920s and 30s, although this is Marsh's only novel of this type. There's a Russian guest named Dr. Tokarev who initially doesn't understand like what a murder game is and suggests that it might actually be real, which of course it's not. And Sir Hubert is immediately fastidious about his murder games. He is well known for how elaborate they are and just like how exciting and bombastic it can be. And to be honest, I didn't really get that vibe as the game laid out. Seems to be like a pretty basic version of the murder game, although to be fair, we don't get to see the exciting conclusion for reasons that will be made clear. The game goes like this. During the course of the day, Sir Hubert's Russian butler, Vasily, will secretly hand a guest a red chip, which will indicate that person as the murderer. The murderer has a certain amount of time to claim a victim by getting them alone, tapping them on the shoulder, and telling them, "You are the corpse," which in fact kills them. The killer then has to shut off all the lights and ring a gong to symbolize the deed has been done. Everyone else must remain still for 2 minutes after the gong goes off to allow the killer to establish an alibi. After an investigation period, everyone who is alive has a discussion, and the group must name a killer. The killer wins if the group identifies an innocent person. No one of this party wants to be the victim because the discussion apparently gets so intense you don't want to miss it, and the victim does not get to participate. The weekend party continues on as normal, and because the murderer hasn't even been chosen yet, everyone is fine with being alone with another person. The discussion quickly turns to a Russian dagger Charles has brought with him, which he claimed to acquire from a German after saving his life, although it's really tells a story that no one really seems to believe. It's clear that some of the guests think Charles killed this man for the dagger, and Sir Hubert wants this particular dagger for his collection, but Charles won't give it up. He does eventually agree to leave it to Sir Hubert after his death and draws up an impromptu will saying such. Sir Hubert is seemingly fine with this, although he's much older than Charles and doesn't actually think like he'll live longer than Charles to inherit the dagger. Dr. Tokarev, meanwhile, is just absolutely infuriated by this. The dagger is a dagger of Russian Brotherhood, and it's not meant to be handled by someone outside of that Brotherhood. He demands Charles hand the dagger over to him for safekeeping, but everyone just ignores the doctor as the lunatic. Meanwhile, Charles has his eyes set on all the women in the house. He's clearly having an affair with both Rosamond and Mrs. Wilde, and everyone seems to know this, but no one openly talks about it. Even Arthur Wilde is at least aware of the possibility his wife Marjorie may be sleeping with Charles Rankin. If this were a later Marsh novel, we would have gone a lot more in depth in character with these incidents. But this is the first Marsh novel, so she just kind of presents the events without much fanfare, without doing all that heavy character work she would later do extremely well. Charles continues to be a menace during the weekend. He's constantly bragging to Nigel about how rich he is. He constantly torments Arthur Wilde and humiliates him, with one instance where he pantses Arthur in front of everyone else. And this just stings so hard for Mr. Wilde because he's not only being humiliated, but the man doing it is sleeping with his wife and basically bragging about all the money he has while Arthur Wilde is heavily indebted. And Sir Charles constantly pokes fun at Nigel as well. And Nigel, during all of this, comes across as just really awkward. He's a very sheltered young man, and although he knows of the things Charles does, he seems to be incredibly shocked by them when he actually sees it for his own eyes. And the day goes by without the murder game victim appearing, and time is running out. Everyone is getting dressed for dinner. Nigel is in his bedroom, which shares a connecting bathroom with Arthur Wilde. Arthur is in the bathtub, and he and Nigel converse through the door when suddenly the lights go out. Nigel waits in place for the 2 minutes. He's actually stuck in this room with a housemaid he finds attractive, but it's just too awkward to interact with her during this. And lights come on, everyone goes downstairs and finds Charles dead. And initially, everyone thinks this is just part of the murder game as Charles the victim. Until they realize Charles is actually dead. He was stabbed between the shoulder blades from the back with that Russian dagger. And Mrs. Wilde essentially gives the show away here by screaming maniacally, very clearly upset, which causes her husband to finally confirm that they were having an affair. And even though he suspected as such, this is the proof he needed. Inspector Allen makes his debut shortly afterward. Scotland Yard is called in because Sir Hubert is such an important person, they won't trust the local constabulary, which does lead to some tension between Scotland Yard and the locals. Allen is assisted by Sergeant Bailey, the fingerprint expert who appears in most books. We don't get Fox yet, nor do we have Thompson, who is the photography expert. And there's some other minor police officers, but they're not interesting and they don't matter. And this obviously begins the investigative portion of the novel, which, if I'm being honest, is really not that interesting. And this is sometimes the case with Marsh, is particularly in these very early novels when she has not gotten the grasp of things fully. There are sparks of good things here, but it's just not fully brought out. Because this is her first novel, I think Marsh was more focused on getting everything right and making sense rather than making things interesting. And I always appreciate accuracy, but this needed to be more entertaining because, quite frankly, it's just not. Thankfully, she gets much better later on pretty quickly. And it's not as if this one is completely void of fun. And for me, it's the lengthy-ish series of interviews with the suspects. I always find this tedious. And to be fair, that's not exactly what we have here, but it has the same effect. Alan initially focuses on Sir Hubert's interest in the dagger, and we learn once again about the impromptu will Charles wrote, leaving the dagger to Sir Hubert. We also have confirmation that Nigel is Charles's main heir, with Arthur Wilde receiving a very small legacy. Alan suggests that the guests continue on with their murder game, largely because no one has admitted to being the murderer in the game, and he wants to snuff out everyone's positioning when the lights went out. The murder game murderer essentially had free reign of the house for 2 minutes unobserved, and this is all for naught, however, as Arthur Wilde admits he was the one selected to play the killer. Wilde admits that he did not really have a plan with the game, and he thought the gong was for dinner and that the lights went out by accident. He took advantage of this to murder Sir Hubert, which Sir Hubert confirms, but then everyone found the body and the game sort of just ended. And there's a lot of talk of like who saw who where, and particularly with the servants. It's not interesting until we learn that Vasily, the Russian butler, has vanished and apparently escaped from the house. Skipping quickly through this large chunk in the middle here, Alan finds a button with a piece of leather attached to it, partially burned in the fireplace. It's part of Mrs. Wilde's glove, one of which she claimed went missing, but only said so when someone suggested it to her. The banister leaning downstairs only has a few recent prints on it. Nigel awkwardly confesses to the crime because he's just awkward and intimidated by Alan, but Alan recognizes this as a nervous tick, and the two become friends over this, believe it or not. Nigel is like something of an outsider here. He's not only because he's not rich, although I mean, he technically is now as Charles's heir, but he's also a journalist, and everyone in the house party thinks he's going to betray their secrets for the sensational story. He strikes up a romance of sorts with Angela, who is like so much more outgoing than Nigel. Arthur Wilde also confesses to the murder, but Alan sees this as like another lie, with Wilde protecting his wife. Mr. Wilde cannot explain anything even remotely close to the murder, and after he does all this, it does nothing but further Alan's suspicions on Mrs. Wilde. Marjorie Wilde was having an affair with Charles, but Charles was engaged to Rosamond, and Marjorie is now the scorned woman. Despite their differences amongst them, the house party all stick together and try to blame Vasily for the murder. No, he's the easy target because he's the servant and he's Russian and he's not there anymore. But everyone except Angela seems to blame Vasily. And Angela is really like the only character in this book besides Alan who has to have like any sense whatsoever. Alan takes Angela and Nigel into his confidence. They go on some like mini investigations, like tracking a package, looking for furs. It's not that interesting or important. We have an even more uninteresting subplot involving Dr. Tokarev and his Russian compadres doing Russian and communist things. Alan arrests the doctor for sedition because he's a member of this like Russian anarchist slash communist group. It's extremely typical of like 1920s and 1930s mystery novels to have like this sort of subplot that like doesn't leak at all into the murder plot. Very patriotic and whatnot, and this is not the last we will see of this kind of thing from Ngaio Marsh. She used it in a lot of her earlier books, but this is by far, in a way, the least interesting use of it. I typically find these plots stale, but this one is probably one of the worst. And the other time she uses it, it's actually like much better and more interesting and somewhat relevant to the plot. But here it feels like mostly filler for what is already a very short novel. I mean, this novel feels like it could have been a short story. Alan brings Nigel and Angela up to London, where they infiltrate this group of Russians that are responsible for a murder that happened like before Charles was stabbed. But this is like the first time we're hearing of this, and it's like 75% of the way through the book. Angela and Nigel learn that Vasily is now actually employed by Alan in a personal capacity. Vasily was once a member of this Russian Brotherhood, but left it and was afraid of that coming out, so he ran away. But Alan, like, somehow inexplicably knew this and hired him as his own butler for some reason. But Nigel and Alan infiltrate and defeat this group of Russians, and this scene, while totally useless to the plot, is very revealing for Alan. Alan climbs in through like the fireplace and gets like covered in like filth and grime and ash. And this is the first scene in a Niall Marsh novel that heavily mocks the aristocracy. This is something so commonplace in her books. But Alan is the younger brother of a duke. He's essentially like Prince William. He's like the spare heir no one cares about because he won't inherit the title. But this scene depicting Alan filthy is a bit of a shock from like the aristocratic point of view. It's already considered distasteful for a man like Alan to be a police officer, and it's even more unbecoming of an aristocrat. But now he's dirty and he doesn't care at all. It's like this minor slap in the face to all like those snobby aristocrats, and the type of content Marshall really amps up moving forward in future novels. And this will conclude the spoiler free section of the summary. I know it's been riveting so far, but if you're still with me, you can back out now if you don't want to be spoiled, or continue going forward if you want to hear the rest of the video. But remember, you've been warned. Now, I don't think A Man Lay Dead is the weakest Allen novel, though it's certainly close, but this is certainly the weakest solution. The murderer is Arthur Wilde, whose motive was money. There's a lot of talk about his wife's infidelity and whatnot, but the motive is money. And it goes a bit unnoticed, but Wilde does inherit money from Charles. It's unnoticed because the bulk of it goes to Nigel and the infamous dagger goes to Sir Hubert. But Arthur Wilde does get some money he can use to pay off his wife's debt. Allen speculates that the incidents of Charles humiliating Wilde is really what led to the murder, as Wilde no longer felt like any moral qualms against murdering Charles. The method of this, though, is where this book gets really questionable. Wilde claimed he was talking to Nigel through the bathroom door, but in reality, it was only Nigel doing the talking. Wilde slipped out of the bathroom to save time, and this is really ridiculous. He slid down the banister downstairs. While doing this, he grabbed the dagger off the wall. At the bottom, he stabbed Charles in the back, which caused Charles to fall forward, hit his head on the gong, sounding it. Wilde then dumped his wife's glove in the fireplace, turned off the lights, ran back upstairs into the bathtub where Nigel was still talking. And this is just ridiculous, but I'll get more into that in my criticism section. Unfortunately, we don't get like an actual resolution involving what happens with Mrs. Wilde and these other people, but Nigel and Angela get together, leaving Alan maybe a little jealous, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this. Until Agatha Troy comes along, Alan does have these like little flirtmances going on with some of the women in these stories, and maybe Angela's one of them, maybe not. It's up to the reader's interpretation. And let's move on to some praise. And as you may have noticed, I don't have a lot of praise for this book. It's not as if like A Man Lay Dead is like in the atrociously terrible category. I mean, to me, it's just mediocre, which I would say like the word that best describes this book is weak. And I will say we do have like these little sparks of genius that would become Ngaio Marsh. There are elements of this book that could have been great. Like I like the misdirection over the inheritance. Readers aren't really like going to look at Wilde just because he inherits so little. I give Marsh a lot of credit for her brazenness and her character depictions, and she always does this, and she never really hides like these more like sexual elements of this book, and she does it tastefully. Marsh is never one to like quote unquote prude up or censor her content involving sex. She's not graphic by any means, but many writers of the day used a lot of like PG euphemisms that Marsh just refuses to use. She makes it very clear what is going on here. And I appreciate she's willing to take a risk. It might sound like I'm struggling for positives, and it's because I am. And while this book holds my attention the whole time, it just like isn't the best one out there. Like I would probably like never going to reread this book again. I only did so for the purposes of this video. And while it didn't take me much time to read, it wasn't particularly enjoyable either. And my list of criticisms is long. I mean, the most obvious thing to knock here is the murder plot, which Niall Marsh herself constantly knocked later in her life. I mean, she admitted this book is just not good, and let's examine why. The murder plot is just ridiculous. I cannot believe someone slid down a banister, grabbed a dagger off the wall while sliding down, stabbed a man in such a way that he hit his head on the gong, burned a glove, ran back upstairs in what's described as like a minute or two without missing a beat. And it just falls apart at the slightest scrutiny, and it's like very convenient. Nothing goes awry for Arthur Wilde. This is certainly like the most unplausible murder plot in a Roderick Alleyn novel, which are full of odd murder methods, but Marsh always executed them in a believable manner. But this ain't it, though. And I have further issues. I mean, the idea that Nigel was just talking the whole time is very convenient for Wilde, and it's not even blocked properly. When the murder is actually happening, the narration is on Nigel talking, and there's a maid in the room, but we do hear Arthur Wilde speaking like at times. There just isn't enough time for him to do what he needs to do. So, that's really an instance of sloppy writing. I wouldn't say it's an issue of fair play because it doesn't feel as if like Marsh is lying to you. It feels more as if this book just like lacked the finesse it needed to. And I have issues with why like Charles left his money to Arthur anyway. That's never explained. And I really dislike the like Russian anarchism, communism subplot. I imagine this played very well in 1934, but to me, I mean, these plots are trite, overused, and like just not that interesting. It felt like padding, although I suspect this was probably always part of the plot, but it didn't need it at all. I didn't find the investigation scenes interesting outside of like those false confessions made, and the mechanics just like didn't entertain me or work. This might sound like an odd criticism, but it felt to me as if Marsh was trying too hard to get like all the mechanics working and like shoved into the book that it detracted from like more interesting aspects of what was going on. Again, I don't think this book is like awful, but it is one of the weakest books from Niall Marsh, which is unfortunate because this is the first book, and I think most people would like want to get into Ngaio Marsh would think like, oh, well, let me start at the beginning, which you know they'll be disappointed, and which is why I do not recommend starting Ngaio Marsh with A Man Lay Dead. Let's talk about our characters, which are mostly fine. There's very few duds here, but like no true standouts. I mean, Roderick Alleyn makes his debut here, and I think this is a strong introduction to our gentleman sleuth. We learn a bit about his background without going like head into it deeply. It's not an info dump, and I think his humor comes across in the like subtle manner it typically does, as well as his slight frustrations with the people around him. He rarely gets angry, but merely miffed when suspects are difficult to handle. He very much feels a bit of like an afterthought because the main character here is actually Nigel Bathgate. It wouldn't be until the next book that Alan becomes the star of the show because we don't have Inspector Fox or Agatha Troy, and he's not really close friends with Nigel here yet. I do feel there are times his personality doesn't really shine through, but that's not like an overall flaw here, and we don't really get to see him play off his friends in a humorous manner like we normally do. Like Sergeant Bailey is here, but he never really had that kind of relationship with him. And even in this book, he's just kind of like there because he has to be. His investigation is very thorough, and we do see his brain hard at work. I think he does a good job of like connecting the dots. It's not his fault the dots aren't the greatest. Alan is about 40 years old here, which is about the age he remains for the next 50 years. And we get the usual, like, handsome Alan references and a bit of his flirtatiousness. We'll see a lot more of that in future books, even before Agatha Troy comes on the scene. Nigel Bathgate, who I always loved as a character, also debuts in this book. He was a lot of fun, but as the main character, I don't think he works. He's definitely better in a supporting role. He's the fish out of water amongst these like awful rich people, and Marsh wants you to feel sympathetic toward him and wants to present him positively. And I think she does that successfully, but as a main character, I think he needed to stand more on his own. He is socially awkward and uncomfortable, which makes him endearing, but doesn't give him like that main character energy. And once Alan comes onto the scene, I think Nigel just sort of fades into irrelevance a bit, and not like intentionally so, but I still think he's a great character here. There's a fun scene where Nigel attempts to be a detective and interviews this like really obnoxious child, and he just cannot get out of her what he wants. So he has no idea how to interact with children. I always found Nigel fun, and he was a lot of fun here, but again, he's best left to the sidekick role rather than the hero. And let's move on to our killer in Arthur Wilde, who I put at number 7 on my list of Niall Marsh's best killers, which in retrospect was probably too high. Now, realistically, does he make the top 10? Probably not. I do find aspects of him interesting, however. One thing that separates the Queens of Crime from the like American men writing detective writers from the same period is that the Queens of Crime usually crafted very nuanced murderer characters. They are really just like outright evil, like we see in American detective fiction. Arthur Wilde, he's a man with a moral code. He's willing to endure his wife's spending and infidelity because he married her. He doesn't want to take like the easy way out of the debt by collecting Charles's inheritance. It isn't until Charles like pushes him by humiliating Arthur that Wilde is willing to take that step. It's his breaking point, and he feels no like gentlemanly obligation to not murder Charles anymore. And I mean, Charles pulls down Wilde's pants in front of everyone else. So, like, I mean, in that regard, I don't know if that's like justified, but you can kind of like feel what Arthur Wilde is feeling here. And otherwise, like, I don't find Arthur Wilde to be that interesting and like in the grand scheme of things. Charles Ranking is our victim, and he's the typical jerk victim. Every time he's on the page before his murder, he just like screams out as the obvious victim here. There's not a lot of nuance with him, which is fine. I don't always need every character to have all these layers. He's a womanizer, he's a gambler, he has very little respect for other people. He's constantly teasing and tormenting people, and he's not like malicious about it. Like the best way to describe him would be like this like bro with like bouts of toxic masculinity. He's never thinking about other people when he's like sleeping with their wife or talking down on them like he does with Nigel. He's not doing it to be hurtful. It's just that he lacks the awareness to realize that his actions do hurt people. He has that devil may care attitude about him. Sir Hubert Hansley is the host of the weekend party. I didn't find him the like commanding presence we're told he is. There's a lot of telling and very little showing with Sir Hubert. We do get a sense of his grand personality at times, and we're told he hosts a very elaborate murder game, but we don't get to see that. I did find him a fun presence, in particular his obsession with the dagger that like really takes precedence in his mind over anything else. After the murder, he sticks with his role as host, but he's worried about not getting that dagger back from the police. And I think Marsh would write like much better versions of this character in other novels, like Lord Pastern and Baggett in Swing Brothers Swing, and like Jonathan Royal and Death in the Dancing Footman are just like two that come to my mind immediately. Angela North is probably the best character outside of the recurring ones, which to be fair, I mean, she is technically a recurring character. We just never see a lot of her moving forward. She's reduced to cameo roles mostly, except for one book. She's really the only female character in this book who is a compelling presence. She's a lot smarter than Nigel, not necessarily academically, although maybe that too, but just like more socially aware and more aware of human nature. She's able to handle that miserable child easily. Like she knows how to go around and talk to people, and she essentially plays both sides here. Like, she's doing work for Alan and investigating, betraying secrets of the others, and the other people tell her things in confidence, and she never loses those trust of those people she's betraying. And her interest in Nigel comes across as more sweet than anything else. Nigel thinks she pities him, and she does care for him, and she is interested in him. And this again plays into Niall Marsh's mocking of the aristocracy. Angela is Sir Hubert's niece, is probably expected to marry someone who's like dreadfully rich man, and but she is not interested in that at all. She doesn't care about status and seems to have this like disdain, but not outright hatred for the rich. She certainly enjoys being rich, and now that Nigel is rich, they can get married without objection. And we don't see this in this book, but in future novels, Nigel and Angela do not live a luxurious lifestyle. They are comfortable, but they don't go like all out with their riches. Marjorie Wilde is a character we see a lot of, but I never felt like we got to know her at all. And that could be because there just isn't anything there. I mean, she's a shallow woman who's very emotional. These people are trying to keep their dirty laundry secret from Alan, but Mrs. Wilde is just like too upset over Charles to care about that. She gives away the show. I mean, which to be fair, everyone already knows. She's not all bad and shallow. She does attempt to keep her affair secret from her husband for his feelings. She doesn't want Arthur to be hurt. The Wilds are no longer in love, but there's still this like the mutual respect they have, and their motivations are mostly guided by not wanting to hurt the other by keeping things secret they already know. And Mrs. Wilde is largely considered the main suspect for most of the book, or at least in the immediate aftermath of the murder, but she's never really convincing to the reader in that role. She's a viable suspect, but not one who comes across as the murderer. So I think the obfuscation falls a little bit flat here, but it's not like a total bomb. Rosamund Grant is probably the largest dud in the book for me. She's a former lover of Charles and she's now engaged to him. They have this on and off type of thing. And to be clear, I mean, Rosamund thinks she's engaged. Now, whether or not Charles Rankin considers them engaged is a bit of an open question. But I didn't find anything Rosamund did to be interesting. I mean, the Mrs. Wilde Charles coupling was far more interesting and more important than Rosamund and Charles. And because of that, Rosamund gets shoved into the background. She's really just another suspect, and a good bit of suspicion does fall on her, but she's never the center of anything going on. She's very forgettable, and I think that the fact that I barely mentioned her in my summary is a good indication of just how much of a dud she is. Dr. Tokarev is a type of character who hasn't aged well, and far be it from me to defend the Russians, but this isn't exactly a good portrayal of his character. He comes across as an idiot and strange because of his foreignness, which isn't great. It's never like outright xenophobic, but it's not good either. I mean, he's very clearly a red herring suspect. I don't think anyone reading this book for the first time would seriously consider him an actual suspect. He feels very much like a distraction. He also provides comic relief in his rantings about the dagger. I think you can interpret him as a sympathetic character. His overzealous protection of the dagger is reminiscent today of cultures defending their artifacts that were stolen by the British and like trying to get them back. I think a reader in 2024 might find that sympathetic, but since he's a Russian and Russians are no friends of the West, perhaps not. I'm not sure if that's really what Marsh was going for. She's aware of the British history regarding other cultures, artifacts, and items, and typically does side with those other cultures, as she will do in books set in New Zealand. However, because Tokarev is still caught up in like criminal anarchism, I think she was simply being a little jingoistic here. And the final character to talk about is Vasily, the Russian butler of Sir Hubert. Vasily appears in future books as Alan's manservant, although he disappears very quickly once Alan marries. He was fun here for what little we saw of him. When he reunites with Nigel and Angela, it doesn't like he ran away because he was a big chicken and thought everybody hated him. And it's a very brief scene, but one I always found funny and endeared me to Vasily. Initially Vasily does come across as like this like villainous character because he's Russian and there's all this talk about like how, the Russians will stick together, despite Vasily clearly not liking Dr. Tokarev any more than anyone else does. And that is it for this video. I think A Man Lay Dead is probably a better book than I made it sound like in this video, but it's definitely a weak book from a Queen of Crime. But the good news is the books only get better from here. And I see a lot of people, both viewers to this channel and elsewhere, say something like, I tried a Ngaio Marsh book and I couldn't get into it. I suspect many people might have started with this book, which I cannot recommend. I would start with Artists in Crime and move forward from there. A Man Lay Dead is not a good place to start with Roderick Alleyn. And just looking ahead, there are a few more Niall Marsh books celebrating milestone anniversaries in 2024 that I may cover. And to be honest, those books aren't that great either. Years ending in four were not good books for Niall Marsh, but we'll see. And there are other author books celebrating milestones this year as well. But next week, I will be discussing adaptations, specifically my 10 worst adaptations of Agatha Christie novels, English language only, and this will be a fun list. And it was actually a lot harder to put together than I thought it would. And I always love talking about bad adaptations of books, like really jokingly bad ones, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.